Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Information Governance, Why Corporations Need It webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, May 8th, 2014, and the recording will be made available shortly following the webinar. I would now like to turn the conference over to Mary Mack, Enterprise Technology Counsel for Xylab. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webcast as a charter supporter of the Information Governance Initiative. We're very pleased to bring you the latest on how the initiative is rolling out, what's being found, and why it's important for the organizations we serve, as well as us as individuals in those organizations. We're very pleased to have one of the driving forces behind the initiative, Barclay Blair, here to speak with us. Barclay is the founder and executive director of the Information Governance Initiative. He's also president of the consulting firm Via Lumina. He's an advisor to Fortune 500 companies, software and hardware vendors. He's internationally recognized and has been out in the wilderness for quite a while on information governance. He's the award-winning author of several books, including Information Nation, 7 Keys to Information Management Compliance, Information Nation Warrior, and Privacy Nation. I'm very much looking forward to what he's found as he's brought the information governance gospel to the community. Barclay?
Hey, Mary. Pleasure to be here today, and thanks everybody for joining. We thought that a good way to approach our session today was just to, Mary and I are going to discuss a few key questions that keep coming up around information governance. This is the first in a series of webinars, and as we go, we'll start to dig into some of the details and get more into kind of practitioner level advice and insight around information governance. Today we're going to focus at a fairly high level. It's fascinating to me because, as Mary said, I've been writing about, thinking about, speaking about, consulting around information governance for many years now. But the reality is that most organizations are just getting started. And this is what we hear consistently at the IGI. And I think there's a huge vacuum out there just for some basic understanding of what information governance is and what it promises to deliver. So we're going to focus on that and hopefully give you some insights along the way. So I think the first question we talked about, Mary, was what is the Information Governance Initiative? And so I thought maybe I would spend a little bit of time talking about that up front, just to provide some context for the rest of our discussion. So I think the best way to answer that question is to look at a couple of quotes that I pulled out here. And what's fascinating to me, and if I think about why we started the IGI, it comes down to this reality that there's actually huge, cognitive dissonance out there around information. In other, to put it plainly, that nobody knows what the hell they're doing. I mean, the left hand or maybe the left brain doesn't know what the right brain is doing, and it's easy to see that if you kind of step back and look at it, and we see this evidence of this inside of organizations and in the market as a whole. So if we look out there, for example, and look at the breathless predictions that are being made around big data and the power of data to make our teeth whiter and our hair cleaner and our lives better, I mean, it's fascinating. There's a fascinating sort of rush to a lot of Kool-Aid drinking around the great things that data can do for us. And you see that here, it's the seismic economic shift that information is a new oil, it's a new asset class, and hundreds of thousands of jobs are going to be created, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So fine, I mean, you can open up the business trade press on any given day and see this kind of thing. What you see less of But what I see every day, and what the other leaders of the IGI see every day, is quotes like this. We hear this from our clients. We hear this from the market. Look, we have untold amounts of junk in our enterprise. I mean, we suspect that. We don't really know because we don't have any great way to actually measure it. We know that a lot of it's outdated. We know that a lot of it might even be toxic. It might be a risk to us down the road. And even if we could get to it, we'd have no idea what it really is, what value it has, and what to do with it. And even if we did, we're not sure who would actually run the project. So I think if you I just wanted to show you this is an actual quote from someone that we spoke to, senior executive at a Fortune 50 company, compared to some of these breathless projections and predictions around big data to I think tell you why we started the Information Governance Initiative, because of this disconnect. Because I do believe that information, if properly managed, can make the world a better place. But we're a long ways away from that. The reality is that we're in a market where I think in many ways the providers of technology are ahead of the buyers in terms of the capabilities of the product and the sophistication of what's possible. We don't have the ability, in other words, to ingest some of this great sophisticated technology that's out there because we don't even know who's in charge of information. And we'll talk about that throughout the day. But that's where my passion comes from. I actually believe that poor information management is a threat to the justice system. I think globally, I think it's a threat to our economy. I think that there's huge threats that come from our inattention to information that myself and the other founders of the IGI and members of our corporate council see out there in the real world every day. So the IGI is a culmination of a 3-year vision that we had to create a think tank and a consortium, to bring together, leading providers in this space to underwrite research in events and peer-to-peer networking and other activities that will help us come together as a community and have this conversation about what the future of information is. This is a conversation that needs to happen with multiple parties, e-discovery and records management, sure, but big data and information protection and information security and data analytics and all of the parts of the organization that today really own a piece of the information puzzle. I've touched on these points, but I think that the other side of it is that the workforce around IG and information governance is really nascent, and it's unclear who owns the problem and who's going to execute on it, because it is a multifaceted problem that we face, and we'll talk about what some of those problems look like. So, I see my mission at the IGI is trying to change this, and maybe that's a grandiose vision. But I think that we can make a measurable difference and measurable progress, and really help, I think, the practitioners in this space. I think lawmakers, policymakers understand what's really required to achieve some of these fanciful visions that are being advanced around information, and in fact, to make clear that unless we are proactive around this, those visions will never be fulfilled. And in fact, we may end up with a much more dystopian vision or reality in the future. So how do we do this? Well, this year, our key kind of foot forward, our thrust into the marketplace is around publishing. So we'll be publishing, and we're working on these now, a series of case studies. What are people actually doing? What does IG look like at work? We've heard that there's a real hunger for that information, and we aim to provide it. Just today, we launched, and some of you on the webinar may have seen this, our first annual report, the beginnings of that, where we are collecting in a whole bunch of different ways and interesting ways the views of the marketplace on information governance. How do they define it? What do they think of it as? We're asking practitioners. We're conducting in-depth interviews, benchmarking interviews, so that we can give the market a sense of what is the state of the art, where are people, and also talking to kind of gurus out there and asking them what they see as the future of information governance. Will it be a thing in 2020? will there be separate categories of technology, or will it be built into the technology infrastructure? And we're going to launch very shortly a community where folks working on information governance from all these different facets come together and have this conversation. So very pleased and honored to be together with the group that is leading the IGI, Bennett and Jason and Jay. And as I say, this is a conversation that began amongst us about 3 years ago, and we were fortunate enough to be able to launch it here in February. So we have an advisory board that has about a half dozen members, and we're building that out. It'll be about a dozen by the time we are done. And our goal with the advisory board is to make sure that we are bringing to bear the perspectives of all the different facets of information governance in our research and in our advocacy activities. We have great representation from Courtney, who is Chief Privacy Officer of Hilton Worldwide, and Richard, who is a former Gartner analyst, who is a leading voice in information security, and Lee, who is comes at it from information governance from a legal perspective, and Julie, who is has a records management perspective. And we're just about to announce a few more board members that come from varied backgrounds, from technology to big data to analytics, and really excited about that. We also have a corporate council of practitioners who are actively working in IG that helps inform our research, and then we have subject matter experts from our supporters who are out there working in this every day and help inform what we're up to. So that's kind of the vision of the IGI, and we invite you to check out our website and learn more about it. And if you can at all, take a few minutes and participate in our survey. You'll see a blog post going out about that shortly. And as I say, many of you have perhaps gotten an email from us.
So, Barclay, one of the things that struck me is when you were putting together the advisory committee is the multidisciplinary nature, the cross-functional nature of it. It looks very much like an e-discovery committee inside a corporation, only externally,
right,
and focused on sharing best practices across industry.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good analogy. I think that e-discovery, one of the great things about the painful the pain that happens through e-discovery is it does force you to ask some critical questions about, well, who do we need in the room, as you say, Mary, when we start to talk about what information we have, where it is, what it is, how we get to it, and those core questions that are at the heart of information governance. So I think that's a fair assessment that that kind of committee, that kind of group that comes together to fight that fire in the context of litigation is probably a pretty similar makeup to our advisory board in its final form.
And at the same time, we were talking about reactive e-discovery, taking care of the e-discovery, at the committee level inside the corporation. But I see with the Information Governance Initiative, I see an up-leveling of this. So sort of getting out of the trenches and it becoming more of a corporate focus, both to reduce risk and then also to exploit opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mary. I think the reality here is that the direst problems that we face and the greatest opportunities we have around information will not be solved or available to us without very senior level vision and support. So while a lot of the pain is maybe felt down in the trenches of inattention to information, certainly there are well-publicized and well-known occasions where that pain very rapidly becomes something that engulfs the CEO, as we just saw with Target, their leader stepping down over a data breach. And, of course, we can open the paper probably on any given day and see evidence of that. What we are kind of mystified by is how, despite all of these high-profile instances, how the management of information has yet to really take hold as a discipline that is owned from the top down. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think that is clearly a key challenge, and one of the things that we are hoping to challenge the market to take on.
Well, I think the participants in this webinar may have seen that same opportunity when eDiscovery first merged in their organizations, that it was something that people were afraid of and nobody really owned, and those who stepped up have markedly different titles today than they did 5, 6 years ago.
Well, I think this is definitely one of the challenges for our charter supporters, is that, and anyone who provides products or services to this market, is that you can't go to Hoover's or wherever and buy a list of people who are trying to solve this problem inside corporate America or around the globe, because it's either a nascent or an ill-defined role that is changing. And certainly that's one of the things we're asking in our survey that we just launched is, are you hiring new people into this role? Are you transforming existing roles? What are their titles? And that's, I expect we'll see a little bit of everything. Anecdotally, I see, some very senior level information governance positions being created, and but I think that's the exception probably right now. We'll find out, I think, when we're completed our survey.
Yeah, you think it'll be a situation more where, as it was with eDiscovery, that the position gets written around the person who's actually doing it because they're already doing it?
Yeah, I think that'll probably be true in many cases. Absolutely. Well, and I think that raises it naturally leads to our next question, the one that in some ways I dread, but is an obvious question to ask, which is, what is information governance? And certainly there's a lot of definitions floating out there. We've actually asked the market in our annual report how they define it, and we pitched effectively this definition to the market and asked them to tell us, do they think this is the right definition or not, and if not, what is the right definition? So we'll see. I think at this point, this is sort of the best operating definition, the one that I use, which is, just trying to keep it simple. This is definitions are a pain in the butt, frankly. And I've spent a lot of my life in conference rooms, having discussions about definitions, and they're difficult because they're so important. I don't think it's down to the words. They're important, and a lot of times we get wrapped around the axle on them, but the concepts embodied in them are critical. And certainly this definition attempts to make the point that, if information governance is to provide value to an organization, then it has to focus both on the risk side and on the value side. And that's a challenge, and I don't think there is actually an organization in most companies today that actually owns that responsibility. My joke about information governance is that it's like a diamond. It's very, very valuable, but it's also very, very hard. And that's I've been consulting in this space for over a decade, and it always wasn't called information governance, but it's morphed into that. And look, it's hard to transform the way that we use information as an organization. It gets embedded into our culture. It gets embedded into our habits, and particularly hard to do it when in some cases we have technology that was designed for a different era. In other cases we just have a lack of leadership at an organization. The key for me with information governance, I think the vision moving forward, is that ultimately it has to be an enabler of business, not friction to the business. And it's easy to say that. I think that it's much harder to achieve that. But I do believe that there is, and I had this conversation with a client the other day, that there's new business models available to organizations who can marshal information in a way that is legally compliant, that takes care of privacy risk, takes care of the information security requirements, business models that just are not available unless and until they can do that. And I think that's really exciting. I think we're seeing evidence of that in kind of the Internet of Things, and this industrial Internet, as information starts to flow about turbines and devices, and we can do some pretty amazing things with those data, but we can only do them in the context of a program that complies with for example, international laws for interjurisdictional issues around privacy and retention, security, and so on. So information governance ultimately is an enabler. Information governance is a big tent. I suppose we'll see ultimately what kind of operationally ends up in that tent, but these are some of the facets that certainly we believe are part of the IG definition and reflect our advisory board as well. The other, I think, really critical thing to think about when you ask what is information governance is I actually think it's useful to realize that you're actually asking at least three separate questions. One is that you're asking, well, what is it as a concept? And that's really the definition that I proposed at the beginning here, is that that's a conceptual definition. How do we think about it as a thing? And, that definition is important. I don't think it's ultimately, holy scripture, but, there has to be, the concepts have to be right, certainly. The second level of what is information governance is, well, what is it as a market? Is it a market? Is it a thing that I can go buy? And ultimately, as any market matures, that question has to be answered. And I don't think that information governance clearly is not something you can go buy and solve your information governance problem. Clearly, there are products that are in the information governance market, products that will, as in totality, will help you solve the information governance problem. A unified way of looking at those, I think, has yet to emerge. And then finally, there's information governance as an operational model. So in other words, what do we do? How do we do information governance? What does it look like? Who owns it? Who's in charge? What are our activities? What are our projects? How do we measure success? Those things. And, so we at the IGI are trying to and working towards providing dimension on all three of those, because I think all three of those questions need to be defined in order to answer the question, what is information governance?
Yeah,
does that make sense?
It does make sense. And when you were talking about risks and rewards, I mean, one of the things I think that you hear sometimes is that legal is the business prevention department.
Yeah.
Because we see so many risks. And here there's an opportunity for the legal department and for those supporting legal to be a leader in actually saying yes and seeing some market opportunities. So can you talk a little bit about who's leading currently, and also how members of our risk-averse community can get more into the yes category?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that the challenge for, as you say, legal as the business prevention department, I think that there's a cultural and an organizational culture challenge here, which is that people ask me all the time, well, who should lead information governance? And of course, like a good consultant, I always answer, well, it depends, which isn't that useful. But the reality is that, by organization, the answer is probably different. I have my opinion, which I'll share in a second, about I think who is the best fit for this at most organizations. I think legal as an owner of this is an obvious candidate. I think culturally one of the challenges is that traditionally the legal function at most organizations is a reactive function. In other words, legal does not typically go out and look for problems to solve, rather reacts to problems that are being brought to it. And I think that's changing. I think that role of the general counsel at many organizations is changing, becoming more proactive and more embedded in the business, which I think bodes well for information governance and legal taking a real leadership role. I do, and I wanted to talk about this in some detail because it is kind of one of my passions, and I think key insight is that as I've been working on this problem throughout my career, time and time again I come to the same realization, which is that there's actually a huge leadership vacuum around information governance. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that at most organizations, information governance will never happen unless this problem is solved. And the problem is that nobody owns the problem of information. So if we look, for example, at the role of the CIO, I mean, just colloquially, it's interesting to sort of say, well, who owns the problem of information? Well, isn't it the guy or the gal that has the word information in their title, which the CIO does? But I actually think in reality there's a huge gap between how most people perceive the role of the CIO and particularly how other senior management perceives the role of the CIO and how the CIO actually perceives the role or what their mandate is. And in the middle of that gap is information. You know, if you have this conversation with a typical CIO, you'll hear analogies like, you know, look, I don't produce movies and television. I just make sure that those get to the end user. In other words, I am not responsible for the content. I own the pipes and wires and the switches and the other elements of that infrastructure. And in fact, Chief Infrastructure Officer is perhaps a better description of what I do. And if I think back to when I first started playing around with the Commodore 64 and hanging out with other, techie type people, hearing this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. And if there's nothing else, this statement is a statement of IT disclaiming responsibility for the information itself. It says, well, we built this beautiful and perfect database, and if you, the business user, are dumb enough to fill it with garbage, that's not our problem. Okay, fine, great. Well, whose problem is it? And I think there's a real vacuum there. It's fascinating if you actually go back to the origin of the concept of the CIO to the early 80s. I found in a magazine from that era this quote, which I thought was fascinating, which is appointing a CIO raises the question of who owns the databases, those who maintain them or those who produce them. And I posit that as of today, we have yet to answer that question. We do not have a good answer to this question. Some organizations are creating chief data officer positions. Those are in the minority. Maybe that's part of a trend. Maybe it's not, but I think this is a huge problem that we have to overcome for information governance. Sorry, Mary, did you...
we see in our clients that there's an application justification committee or something like that as applications as new technology or databases get launched, but the actual qualitative management of it, I think that there is a huge void there.
Yeah, and it's we see it every day, and I think it's a challenge. The people, more often than not, what I hear from folks who are actively trying to build or solve information governance at their organizations is a frustration of a lack of support from senior management. Now, admittedly, some of the time, that's because they're not being realistic and they're not approaching senior management in the right way. But other times it's just simply the fact that no one actually owns this, is accountable for it from, if you think about a RACI chart at a senior level. This is not an IGI survey, but one that I ran with my consulting firm with ARMA and EDJ Group. We did it in 2001, and then at the end of 2013, we asked participants in the survey, who owns information governance at your organization. And it's interesting, you see that the general counsel, the number of respondents who said the general counsel owns it is more than double in the intervening 3 years. And the CIOs actually dropped, CEOs stayed about the same, and there's it's still a tiny number, but there was a big increase in the number of people who said that the COO owns it, which I think is interesting. Maybe it means nothing. It could indicate that for some organizations at the leading edge of this market, they're moving into more of an operational role, and so we see that responsibility coming to the COO, the Chief Operating Officer. Another interesting year-over-year result was, twice as many people answered this question in 2001 that I don't know as did in late 2013. So there is, there's certainly more maturity emerging. I think we're still quite far from clarity on the ownership and on the stakeholders, but there's progress.
And here we've had a couple of questions, and I think that leads into our discussion here. We have a question from a records administrator from a large city government who obviously must deal with a budget. And so his question is, how do you bring this forward to a COO and a CFO that this will be cost efficient and good for the organization? So what reasons are you seeing that organizations are actually willing to take this on?
Yeah, we've got some ideas about that. It's one of the most frequent questions we get. So good question, and I'll answer it. I'll give you some more sort of detail on that. But the reality is that we are not very good at quantifying the cost and the value of information, and something that we need to get much better at, and something that we're hoping to help with at the IGI. Even with that, the thing that I would counsel you to think about is that a return on investment or a total cost of ownership calculation. Maybe this is a little too cynical, but my experience is that at most organizations that's more a political exercise than it is a financial one. In other words, many times when those exercises are done, a decision has already been made, and the exercise is being done to justify the decision. Backing away from that perhaps cynicism a little bit, I think that it's absolutely critical that you have the fluency around the business case as you advance information governance. Some organizations that doesn't matter. Some organizations, frankly, I would say that those organizations that are in the lead with information governance, they're not in the lead because someone woke up one day rationally and said, oh, we're going to be a leader in information governance. No. Frankly, they're there because something very bad happened. Something blew up. The house caught on fire. And when they went to put the fire out, they realized they had inadequate tools, that the house was full of oily rags, and then it was a disaster, and they didn't want to go through that again. The vast majority of my clients, and I think most organizations doing work in this space, come from that perspective, which is why I think the U.S. is leading the world in information governance, because of the litigation environment here is just globally unique and a huge driver. So I'd say that the risk element is what's driven the leading organizations. The next tier that's coming up are those that maybe something bad has happened, maybe they see it coming, maybe it hasn't, but they have started to take it on as an operational discipline. We just talked to had a conversation this morning about the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy, for example, when a ship comes off a tour and comes into port, they clean up shared drives. This one of our charter supporters after navigation was telling us this story, that they clean up shared drives as part of the sort of the cleanup and refit process, because it's part of operational excellence for them. So there are those organizations. But there's no slam dunk here. The reality is that you have to kind of take the temperature, the culture of your organization. Is it motivated by risk avoidance or motivated by financial upside? And then build the case. I think that at most organizations, the case is there on both sides of that coin. Which actually leads to our next question, doesn't it? Why do organizations do it? Which I can answer. Actually, if we go back to the same survey, just to kind of give you some data, and we'll get more data on this. Our annual report, by the way, our surveys and our data collection process is happening through May, and we are planning on publishing our reports in June or maybe early July, so about mid-year.
And where can people get the annual report?
At our website, IGIinitiative.com.
Good.
So this data from our previous, as I mentioned, the previous survey that we did with RMA and EDJ, we asked in 2011, has your company allocated budget over the next 12 months? And then we asked it again, and you can see it's about double, about number the number of respondents who said yes, that we have allocated budget over the next 12 months for IG is about doubled. About 20% don't know, which I'm actually not surprised by. I guess, back to the question of kind of justifying or making the case internally for information governance, to be very rudimentary about it, because sometimes I think it's just useful to go back to first principles, remind ourselves why we're talking about this in the first place, is that there's really only two stories to tell, right? And there's two sides to this coin. And you saw this embodied in the definition. It's not rocket science, but I mean, let's go back to first principles. Why do we spend money on software, services, people? Why do we spend time trying to manage information better? Everything boils down to one of these two reasons. One is that we want to avoid risk, so it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The other is that we want value. We want to run our business faster, better, or cheaper. When you think about it, we want to do something more quickly, we want to do it more efficiently, or we want to drive down costs. Is really the three reasons we invest in anything as a business. So you need to understand that your organization, well, what is the story? Both of those stories are valid, and information governance will, in fact, provide a return on both sides of that story. But at your organization, which one is really the one that you want to lead with? I kind of view that in the market as a whole, in the macroeconomic perspective, there is this pendulum that continually swings between fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and faster, better, cheaper. And we can say that, in 2008, 2009, clearly the needle was pinned very firmly over to the left, and perhaps we're swinging back from that now as some of the indicators in the economy look a little more positive. And that changes how organizations behave, obviously, and the kinds of projects they fund and why they fund them. Generally speaking, when everyone is making money hand over fist, risk falls to the bottom of the list. When everything collapses, as it seems to do every couple of decades, then we start to invest in risk. And I guess that's a reality. That is an overall kind of macroeconomic reality. What you need to kind of answer for yourself when you're making the case for information governance or trying to convince the organization to take it on is, at your organization, where is this needle pointing? What is the primary cultural orientation or the financial reality of your organization, and orient your program towards this. Here's an example of told right from a plan, a strategy from a client who was invested in IG in a big way because of concerns about risk. This is a quote, growing external compliance and risk elements associated with information, and here are some of them. And this is a company that one of the ways they went after this was to create a Protect the Brand Committee of very senior executives that every month would survey their business activities in the landscape and what was happening in the regulatory environment, and say, well, what are the risks to our brand that could emerge from these decisions we're making, and how do we mitigate those risks? And that's how a major investment in information governance was made. This is how the decision to spend money on it was made. Here's another company where the topic of risk, although they had a very strong compliance function, it wasn't what motivated spending. It didn't get anybody excited. It was not part of their cultural orientation or their operating reality. So this is the language that was used, maximize the net present value of information over its life cycle, as a headline in a strategy and a decision document presented to the board that ultimately funded a very large project. That should say $500 million, by the way, not $500 billion. So it would be a really big number. And so the point is that this pendulum between fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and faster, better, cheaper. Look, at the end of the day, these two companies' programs actually look pretty similar, but the way that they were sold and justified internally was very different. Is that what you see as well, Mary, when you talk to your clients?
Exactly. Many of our clients have felt the pain of e-discovery, and so that's eminently quantifiable, at least in the larger sense. Although some of our clients have have some issues with their billing systems and trying to figure out what costs are allocated to what. In our view, in our experience, a lot of it is reactive, and then reuse of the technology for the more proactive information cleanup in the sort of in the valleys of activities. But as I look at the landscape moving forward, especially with proportionality taking on a bigger import in the legal area, I'm seeing more emphasis on quantification of all sorts of things.
Right.
And so I would think that you've got the CFOs as well as part of a part of the information governance community. How important do you see actually putting numbers forward? To the success. Yeah. I mean, I know you talked about it sort of like a gut feel, but and with the numbers coming after the fact. But how important do you think the numbers actually are?
Well, I mean, I can tell you that from a consulting perspective, they've only grown in importance over time. Yes, there are still those companies who who don't calculate the cost of the firefighters when the house is on fire, and that might be litigation or investigation or some other bad thing, externality happening. But in general, I think that we're clearly moved into an era where the promise of quantification of everything from how many calories I'm putting in my mouth to how many steps I took today to how much information am I generating as a business and what value I'm getting from it are very of the moment. And there's a promise of making more business decisions from a quantified perspective rather than a qualitative perspective. I think that so I think it's very important. I think that there is clearly there's models like return on investment, total cost of ownership, and others that try to account for use options calculation formulas like Black-Scholes and others that you can get very sophisticated with these. I think your mileage will vary depending on, ultimately you have to quantify those cases in the quantification to the metrics that your company cares about, and that's the key. That's how you get smart with these exercises. I think it's when you start to talk about quantification, you start to talk about the path to value. I think that we also need some creative and some innovative thinking here. And I just wanted to quickly touch on a few ideas that I've advanced. And this actually came from some research that I did with another charter supporter, Nuix, that I think are just kind of designed to challenge our thinking about how we quantify the value and the cost of information. For example, here in New York City, and under the Bloomberg administration, we had the so-called Bloomberg soda ban, where it was illegal to sell the chain restaurant, soda in containers larger than I think it was 8 ounces. It wasn't very big, but and in California and New York as well, you have the requirement for calorie labeling on menus, and so you can find out that your caramel macchiato is 800 calories in the morning. And what's interesting about these food labeling laws and so on is that they're actually based on well-established behavioral science, where they do things like set out 3 pots of 3 jars of M&Ms and with 3 different size scoops, and let people free feed on these candies. And of course, what happens is the people with the bigger scoops eat more candy, and science like bigger plates make you eat more, and etc. And so this behavioral science has made its way into lawmaking, and it's actually an interesting concept, I think, from an information perspective. Is that is there something like the information calorie? Is there value in helping or labeling, if you will, the environments that employees work in, so they understand that information has a cost, that information isn't free, to try and again encourage behavior. In most organizations, the reality is top-down policy on this stuff doesn't work. So maybe this is a way to quantify and to help to drive change in the organization. You know, another idea that I've advanced is the idea of information cap and trade, and this is drawn from cap and trade in the U.S. Of course, globally has a lot of attention right now around limiting carbon emissions, but it actually was a regime originally implemented to combat acid rain in the 70s and 80s, so sulfur dioxide emitted by factories in the U.S. And the regulatory regime, the regulators decided, well, we're not going to implement, Pigovian or punitive taxes on sulfur dioxide. What we're going to do is actually determine, if you're a factory of a given size producing a given type of product, then you have an annual quota of this many tons of sulfur dioxide. Fine. Okay, great. Well, now the interesting part is if you emit less than that quota, you actually have a fungible or a monetizable credit that you can actually sell on an open market to those who don't come in under their quota, thus creating a really interesting financial incentive to do better. Look, we don't care how you get there, but if you reduce your overall emissions, then there's a financial upside. And that's actually, I have a client who's actually experimenting with this. It's kind of a form of chargeback, if you will, around information to try and drive some better habits, some better hygiene, some higher performance around information. And it's all based on quantifying really how much information we have, where it is, what it is, how much it costs, and then implementing it in a kind of a unique way. The other method that I am a big fan of is full cost accounting for information, and I find it actually hilarious that this was a method that was developed by municipal governments in the United States as a way of trying to figure out how much they should charge a homeowner for picking up and getting rid of their garbage. So in other words, what is the cost of that service? Is it the fuel and the employees, or is there a larger cost that they have to account for? And ultimately, this idea of full cost accounting was kind of codified by the EPA. You see it in other areas of business now, but the idea is let's agree on a model that tries to account for both the hard and the soft costs, the cost of the things that we value in our organization. And I think it's actually a fascinating model for information as well. I think that at the end of the day, I don't really care whether everything I'm talking about today is called information governance or not. I don't really care what it's called. I don't care. Inevitably, any concept like information governance will peak in terms of its popularity and its interest and its faddishness, and maybe it will wane. What I hope for is that the things that we're talking about under the rubric of information governance, about getting better at doing something so fundamental to our lives and to the future of our lives in our organization, that we get better at it. And I'm hopeful that we can help to usher that in.
So we have a couple of questions coming in about how to get involved with the community, and then also, are there local or chapters, if you will, so that people who are starting to do this don't reinvent the wheel?
Well, look, if you want to start a local chapter, call me, email me. I'd love to help you do that. I'd love to spread the gospel. Again, look, it's we need to. The one thing that we need to do for sure is we need to find a way to get all the people who own a piece of this puzzle together and talking. So whatever we can do to help that's what I'm committed to doing. Hit our website, hit the join button at the top, and join up. Give us your information so that we can include you minimally on the things that we publish, like our upcoming annual report and our case studies and so on. More than that, we would love to get you involved in our corporate council. If you're a practitioner actively working in this space and trying to solve this problem internally, we want you to come to us and join with your peers to not reinvent the wheel, to talk to them to find out what they're doing. Our benchmarking work that we're doing right now, which will be published again in June, July timeframe, is explicitly that. It's explicitly designed so that you can see how other organizations are doing this, how they're solving it, how they're going about it, so you don't have to start from scratch, and that you can kind of see where you are in relation to them. Absolutely, that is part of our mandate here, is to help you avoid reinventing the wheel. And
then if I can pull a couple of questions together, we have a question about what the prospects are for the discipline becoming an area of legal practice rather than just a fad, and then a very practical concern about, is it normal for an in-house e-discovery counsel to be excluded from the information governance activities?
Is it normal? That doesn't sound normal to me. I guess the latter question, I would not, certainly would not advocate that. I think that, one of the things we've learned over the last decade through e-discovery is that oftentimes e-discovery is literally, well, not literally, but it's where we learn the truth about our information environment. And the tragedy of e-discovery and the way that it's been done is that the practitioners who lead the charge in e-discovery just have not had the time, in most cases, or the mandate to fold back what they've learned about the information environment into the organization. In other words, to have an ability to, when they realize that what's happening in the email environment, in the database environment, in the shared drive environment is horrific, they need to go on and fight the next fire. And so there hasn't been a pipeline for them to share that information and help change the organization. And so I do think that is emerging, in fact, as a role. And I think that's a huge role for e-discovery professionals and legal professionals, is to take what they learn and what they have learned and what they see through the process of investigation, of truth finding, and then to give that knowledge back to the organization in a way that they can operationalize it, that they can make real, permanent, and proactive changes. Do I think it'll become a profession? I don't know. I think I'm curious about that as well. It's certainly something we're asking in our survey. I don't know. When I talked about IG as a concept, as a marketed as an operational model, I think that's where that operational model piece is still very much emerging. We certainly have clients who have created senior level IG positions to whom reports a e-discovery person, an IT person, a records type person, and they sit in kind of a business function, but that's in the minority today. So I'm not sure. I hope it does.
Yeah, I think that's good. And so how should the people on this call get started with their organization?
Yeah, we're almost out of time. I guess what I would say is the best way to get started is to get started, right? Which is a little bit glib, but you have to ask yourself, first of all, the question: do you have senior level management support? If you don't, what you will be able to accomplish will be limited by that. And so you need to decide whether it's better to go try and focus your effort on getting that support first, or is it better to focus on some achievable goals so you can demonstrate progress and mastery and possibility for what the benefit to the organization of a large, more enterprise project. That's where you need to decide, and based on that decision, go and execute. I'd say that right now, of course, what's driving a lot of activity in the market is defensible deletion, because, in other words, going out and looking for stuff that you can throw away because there is a hard dollar saving. That's certainly one of the projects that we see lots of evidence of. We see cleanup migration projects, migrating from unmanaged to managed environments, trying to do that in a way that provides business value. So it varies, but I think that decision about, are there some tactical so-called low-hanging fruit that we can pluck, or is our time better spent trying to make a case here to collect some facts and present that to get broader support for a program?
Yeah, along those unmanaged to manage, we're also seeing we're seeing projects where there's a cleanup where the triggering event is the move to the cloud. So let's not move the garbage piles around.
Right. Yeah, and look, I would say that we hope to provide, as I say, through our work at the IGI, some really concrete answers to those questions. How do you get started? What are the projects people are doing? Where are they at? What worked and what didn't, through our case studies and through our benchmarking. And that's part of our goal. The other thing that we're doing is that we're trying to work with as many partners as possible who own a facet of information governance, so that we can do things like try and integrate the concept of information governance into our architectural frameworks, so that information governance becomes something that is just kind of built into the way we do business, the way that we implement and operate technology. So I'm optimistic. I think it's a big challenge, but I certainly appreciate the support of our charter supporters, including you, Mary, and Xylab. We wouldn't be possible without it.
Well, Barclay, I want to thank you for walking us through your thoughts here, and for the work you're doing to get beyond what I'll call the anecdata. I mean, because we all have stories of what's happening out there, to actually get some concrete data, which I think will be a wonderful tool in the hands of our community members to move the practice forward. I think we're very well positioned to have a wonderful influence on the profitability and the longevity, sustainability of our organizations, and we're at a very important point in our society when we're having the conversations about security and privacy, and to have all of us have a seat at the table armed with information. I think you're doing us a great service. And I want to thank all of our participants in this webinar for your kind attention today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the conference call for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines. Have a good day, everyone.